you've explained to me, and I've read your book, of course, that there's different areas of financial capacity. Can you define those for us?
Okay. So I'm going to go through the 9 domains that make up financial capacity. This is research that has been done at the University of Alabama with Dr. Marsan, who is both attorney and neuropsychologist. Right. And it's something we've been following for the last 10 years.
And you're not going to see all these things at once, you know. Some of these domains will present to you in the context of your relationship with a client. Some of them you won't see at all because that's what the client does when you're not with them.
The critical part, that the takeaway we want you to go with this is that you will see we start with the domains that are very, very concrete, and we add to the domains as we get to the 7th, the 8th, the 9th domain, which is far more sophisticated and far more conceptual. And that's where we start seeing where the true financial capacity starts to drop off in these later domains, often not in these basic domains. But all of these domains are affected, particularly by diseases like dementia. So the first domain, and this is just an example of the domain of basic money skills, is the ability to identify the relative worth of currency. The second, financial conceptual knowledge. Do they understand a basic concept like a loan? What is a loan? The third domain, cash transactions. Do they understand about price in terms of changes in increase or decrease? Can they discriminate with those? Fourth example of another domain would be something involving checkbook management. Do they understand their charges? And in this situation, we've been looking at their managed accounts and the statements that they're going to be getting. Can they understand, if they've got a cash management account, how to be able to use that and problems that may come about in terms of the various deposits? This is a next level, bank statement management. Can they identify balances? And in your industry, are they able to then see various transactions that have occurred in their account, various interests that have been added, or other changes that happen in their account? Number 6, financial judgment. Do they understand value? Does this start to change? And this is where we start seeing that people that start having any kind of neuropsychological problems, dementia, health-related problems that affect cognition, that this is an area, a skill that starts to erode rather rapidly. And this is where they start having problems with judgment about risk, and this is where they get set up repeatedly for scams. Number 7, bill payment. More and more now, older people are starting to adopt the idea of being able to go online and pay their bills. And what we see when this domain starts to erode, people forget about paying bills or they pay them multiple times. But this is a real thing that we see often during the holidays when kids go home and see their parents and see the stacks of mails and realize that taxes haven't been paid, etc. And then the last 2 domains have to do with knowledge of personal assets and or the state. Do they understand where their income is coming from? Do they understand how much they can potentially give away if they want to give money to charity? We've evaluated people who come into the office. Their kids are concerned that they, in fact, may be spending money that they don't have, and they'll make crazy statements like, "There's no way I can ever run out of money." And they're writing large checks to the local church building fund. And it's clear that they're being taken advantage of. And then the last area, the investment decision-making domain, this is where, I was talking about being able to donate money. Can they recognize the risk, and can they discriminate between good and bad choices that are being offered in terms of investments? And this is the area of which that you're repeatedly interacting with your clients on this high level of interaction. And just the takeaway here is the complexity of what makes up financial capacity. And if any of these domains are being affected, then your client is starting to show the red flags of having some degree of diminished capacity.
And again, is it correct in saying that we're looking for patterns over time?
Of course, because one of these things by itself doesn't tell you the whole story. The brain is very complicated with billions and billions of connections. When those start to be damaged, the trouble may show up in different ways, but eventually there are going to be groups of things that you see, red flags, or diminution of their ability to make financial judgments or follow advice that tell you something is wrong.
And the other way that you get tricked is that the nature of how the brain is affected, particularly when people have the beginnings of dementia, is that they can be perfectly clear one day, one morning, you call them the next afternoon, and they completely didn't remember what you said or got very confused. And so people can trick you a lot of times, particularly very, very intelligent people that have a lot of reserve.
Is it fair to say also that people who start to suffer some diminished capacity also can, particularly more intelligent ones, develop pretty good coping skills that can cover it?
Well, look at Donald Sterling here. He did pretty good till he got in front of the judge and demonstrated everything that was wrong with him. Yeah, I mean, people do cover. Intelligent, educated people have more brain reserve, so they can go longer while they're impaired. But if you remember one thing about diminished capacity, and Alzheimer's in particular, remember this. At the earliest stages of dementia, financial capacity is already moderately impaired. By the time they get to the later stages, they're already severely impaired. In the middle, they're severely impaired. So it doesn't track early stage, early impairment, middle stage, moderate impairment. No. Severe impairment occurs much earlier in the process.
So Carolyn, can you tell us about the risks of financial capacity?
Sure. Now, remember, one of the things you said in your discussion was you debated whether to sue the advisor.
Yes.
All right? So exposure to liability is real. I spent 27 years as a plaintiff's lawyer, so I know how lawyers think about who they're going to go after. If there is someone to blame, do not let that person be you. You want to take reasonable steps. You can't fix the world. You're not a doctor. You can't diagnose dementia. But you have to take reasonable steps. That's what we're urging upon you. You're in a unique position. You don't want to expose yourself to liability for twiddling your thumbs while your client's going off the rails, and you should have known.
Well, hopefully you'll get better.
Yeah, you don't get better from dementia. And, you know, impaired clients lose money, but as we demonstrated in the contest, you lose money too. The assets under management that they're at risk of, you know, being victimized for are the assets that you're going to lose fees for. So that's something we want you to keep in mind. So when the person has 100% capacity, they've got all 9 of those domains we mentioned perfectly intact. And there are some people who will be that way till they drop dead, and it's great. Now, his mom, Alice, at 93, I would say is completely competent. Now, she can't read the risk assessment questionnaire and understand it, but if you asked her questions about what she wants and what's going on with her money, she's quite clear about her wishes and very capable of making her own decisions. Thank goodness. But when capacity is partly diminished, I remember, if you remember Mr. Sterling, who, you know, had been diagnosed by a neuropsychologist as having diminished capacity, and he decided to fight it. There was just a little bit of money at stake, right? And he got into court and demonstrated for the judge exactly how impaired he was. He was interrupting and, you know, being out of order, and so he sounded okay when he was on TV, and there were people who would have told you he was fine. There didn't seem to be anything wrong with him to me, was a comment that was made by someone who was interviewed in this whole legal mess. But the truth is, he had diminished capacity for a huge financial decision. And that one had to go before the court. If we can do a good job, maybe we can keep some of these out of the court, where the people are not wasting the family wealth on fighting about it.
But it's also indicative that a lot of times that there are organizations and people around someone with diminished capacity that kind of run fodder to be able to ensure that they are protecting their clients.
Sure. You know, families cover up. The elders cover up. Ever had a husband and wife come in and the wife or whoever answers all the questions? Okay, they're covering sometimes for a person who can't quite keep it together, and that's a warning sign for you. So beware of that. You know, you've got to see your client by himself. All right, so at the far end we have total incapacity, and remember, when we're talking about dementia, total incapacity does not happen at the severe stage of dementia. It happens in the middle. At the beginning, there's already moderate impairment. In the middle, there's already severe impairment. Keep that in mind if your client is sort of mildly impaired. They've already got problems with financial decision making.
Bill payment, again, obviously this is kind of a new concept for the older generation, but more importantly, understanding the concept of how you can time different ways of being able to make payments, being able to track that, being able to understand the ins and outs of how that works, a bit more sophisticated in terms of financial knowledge.
And they often need help at home with this one. I remember when my grandmother developed dementia, my uncle, her son, noticed that she was paying bills twice. So her judgment was starting to erode because she could not recall that she had paid the bills. So this is another sort of signal to family members that the person may be losing it. And one question you can ask them is, are you having any help paying your bills? Is there anybody else taking that over for you or assisting you at home? You know, it's a fairly common thing that family does, is step up and start managing that piece for them.
And we see that come also up often during the holidays when families are getting together and the adult children are visiting mom or dad, and they find out that they go into their study and see stacks of bills, stacks of property taxes not been made, et cetera, et cetera. It's very common that this starts to erode and affecting their financial capacity, financial ability. And then the last two domains is a more general one, knowledge of personal assets and their estate. This is a much more global understanding in understanding what they have and what they are trying to manage in terms of hopefully being able to not outlive their money. And then the last and final one is the actual investment decision making, where they can engage in understanding strategies about how one strategy versus another strategy, let's say in terms of a portfolio, is more conservative than another, and what the net effect of that is, or what the risk is of that. I'm fascinated with this particular area. Recently, my 93-year-old mother decided to change investment advisors, and she went with an investment advisor who sent her, I think it was about a 14 or 15-page questionnaire about her risk management.
Risk tolerance.
Risk tolerance.
Yeah,
And
right.
my mother looked at it, was completely cross-eyed. I couldn't believe that she was supposed to fill this thing out just by looking at this document. And it took quite some time for me to explain to her many of the basic concepts of what, you know, if you had this mom, would you rather have this or that? It was very hard for her because the way that it was written, it was not concrete whatsoever, and it expected a certain level of sophistication, which in my mom's particular situation, I don't think she ever had that level of talent before.
All right, but what do we mean by escalation? Okay. The regulators are telling you that they want you to have a policy in place for escalation. Typically that means within your own group of financial professionals, colleagues, this organization, wherever. You need a committee, someone to talk to. If you don't work for a large organization where they have a compliance department or a legal department or people from both of those working in unison to help you know what to do next, then you have to create your own. When I say escalation, I'm saying talk to a colleague or two that you've already set up to do this with you. Gee, my clients seem to forget that I talked to them earlier today and asked me the same question, then called back the third time. That's a red flag, right? Okay, well my policy says when I see 3 red flags, I'm going to then call the person who's designated as the power of attorney or the contact in the event of a problem. All right, but if you get to that colleague and say, yeah, that sounds bad to me, or I think maybe that's just, you know, his habit, he does this all the time. Whatever it is, 2 heads or 3 heads are better than 1. The point of escalation is that within your own framework of being a financial professional, you have feedback from someone who's knowledgeable.
That makes sense.
That's escalation.
Okay.
That escalation leads to contacting the third party, but it is not the same process.
Gotcha.
It's also standard protocol in large wirehouses that if there are concerns that you as a broker see with your clients, that your supervisor will often encourage you to escalate it to compliance. And compliance in large wirehouses is basically attorneys and their advice in large wirehouses in dealing with these aging-specific problems is to often advise the advisor to get rid of the client because they're a potential liability. And what we found from the research is that people in compliance departments are not any better than the broker or the advisor or anyone. They're not any better in understanding what's going on. Well, it's also very clear where their alliance is, and their alliance is to cover their ass and to cover the institution and to make sure that they don't get sued. And so the best way is to do that is to make sure that you get rid of that client regardless of the fact that they have $100 million under management.
Well, and that the advisor is a fiduciary to the client. So the allegiance shouldn't be to the house, it should be to the client, and getting rid of the client puts them at risk as opposed to keeping them where you can keep them safe.
Well, isn't that why some of you are independent?
So we hope that we're getting you and moving you in the direction of moving from being comfortable to maybe being a little uncomfortable about thinking about that if you're going to age successfully, that you need to take action now and you can't put it off. And you need to prepare. And you need to prepare certain things. And there's some simple things that you can prepare to ensure certain wishes that you have will in fact be followed through on. And here's a really good example of that. A number of years ago, my father, after we encouraged both Mom and Dad to have a health care directive, came to me and said, I'm really happy. I wanted to send you a copy of the document that both your mom and I have signed for our health directive, and I want to make sure that you understand, and this did come to be, that if, God forbid, anything happens to me, I don't want my life to be maintained with any kind of artificial ways. And I want to make it clear that you and your sister are able to honor my wishes. And I looked at my father and I said, Dad, I really understand, and I think that's wonderful that you're taking care of doing this now and making sure that all are clear on what your wishes are. But Dad, I want to ask you a real basic question. When in the lifetime of both my older sister and myself, do you remember us being able to ever make a decision together without conflict? I said, you know how different we are. My wonderful older sister is a very emotional person, a very stubborn person, likes to be in control, and it's her way or the highway in a lot of ways. And I think I'm a little different. Maybe I still got that stubbornness, but I said to my dad, if that decision it's got to happen, and someone needs to make that most difficult and honored decision of whether or not to maintain your life with artificial means or not. Don't you want to rethink this? Because I think this is just going to create a major conflict. In fact, I'm going to help you, Dad. I'm going to tell you that if that's the choice, I'd prefer that you just take my name off and give that responsibility to my sister and make sure that she's clear about what it is that you want, and I'm more than willing to accept that. But I said, Dad, think about this. It's got to be someone that's going to honor your wishes, that is going to focus on what you want, not necessarily what they need to take care of their emotional needs. And not that I'm a saint, but I think that's something you need to reconsider. And God loved my father. He came back and said, you know what? I think I want you to do it. But, I thought it was the more democratic thing, which is my father, don't make waves. That was the more democratic thing to elect both of you. And I said, Dad, that's the source of the greatest conflict that we see in aging parents right now, are people that come to us that have documents that have, and we can talk a little bit about it, that have identified many of the siblings who haven't talked to one another for 20 or 30 years, and all of a sudden they're forced to talk to one another, deal with making major decisions about care and money, and that beef that they had way back when they were 12 or 13 or 14, they have never forgotten about it, and that's what surfaces, not taking care of Dad or Mom. And so one of the things we want you to walk away from this is that you've got to think about what are some of the things that you can do in terms of planning. We're going to talk a little bit today about the presentation and specifically about what we hope that you'll gain from our quick presentation. There are 3 points that we will hope that you will gain, and one has to do with increasing your level of expertise and understanding about aging clients from some of the basics that you need to know, but also to improve your motivation to want to learn more about aging clients and how to protect them, and also how to protect yourself. And third objective here is learning how to become the guardian of your aging client's financial future in a very groundbreaking way.
Some of your clients are already impaired, as you know, and they're impaired by age 65, sometimes sooner. Many of your oldest clients are also impaired, and to a greater degree as they age. The risk of developing brain disease or dementia doubles approximately every 5 years after the age of 65. Rather terrifying.
You don't have to be an expert, but you do have to be aware of how aging affects what you do with your clients. And what we're going to talk about now are these red flags. And these have been talked about and identified by researchers and talked about through the federal government, the things you should be able to spot and see.
So one of the major problems I think you both have seen is not only is there conflict between the parent, the aging parent, and the children, but the conflict that happens among siblings also.
Absolutely.
And,
Very common.
And that must be very detrimental for any form of healthy care for their aging parent. So I know that you guys work with communication, and so what are some of the techniques that you use to try to bring, if somebody's out there in our audience right now and says, I really want to be able to do this, but my brother just won't let me. What can we offer as something they can do themselves? Because we don't have any control over the other person.
Let me give you step number one.
Excellent.
Okay. Step number one, clearly, we've got to make an agreement that we're not going to focus at all on the past. We've got to stay in the present right now.
Great.
Okay?
Ground rules.
Clearly.
That's
Ground
ground
rules.
rule number one.
Number one,
Okay.
we've got to stay in the present, and we've got to agree that we're not going to go there. We're not going to deal with the dirty laundry. Our issue right now is to deal with caring for mom or dad. That's our focus, and we've got to make that agreement. So that's number one.
Right.
Okay. The second ground rule, you want to do the
Yeah,
second?
well, I think one of the other really important things is that we've got to really listen. Let's say it's your sibling, and you've been annoyed with this person for years, or you don't speak to them very much, or you avoid them because they're just a pain.
Right.
And they're
Okay?
older than you.
Anybody around
and
have
they're
a
older
sibling
than
who's a
you.
pain?
And they
Right.
bossed you around a lot.
You never like them very much, really.
Never let you play with their friends.
And now, you're doing all the work, and they're sitting around and telling you that you're not doing it well enough.
Right.
This is a common problem. But it's hard, but I think another sort of basic ground rule is to try to put yourself in their shoes. Try to see the problem the way they see it. Look at it through their eyes. If you can make yourself do that, it
Through
really
the
helps.
siblings.
Through the sibling, for the
Okay.
one you don't like.
Right. Try to see it their
What's
perspective.
their perspective? What does that
Okay.
look like to them? And then you can say to them, I think from your point of view, it must look like, and then you say what you think it is they're seeing. Is that right?
It's not blame.
Right.
And that's a thing we've got to work around.
It's more questioning.
It
It's
is.
questioning.
And it's one of the third things that we want to work on too, which is don't make assumptions. But the question is also indicative of what we do in our society, which is that we don't plan to get old, and we don't plan to have diminished capacity, and we don't plan to do those kinds of things. And what we know now, obviously, is if we can begin to educate people about the importance of getting these documents in order before they start to lose it, and understand, particularly people that don't have children, what are the potential risks if they don't have certain things in place, like what you were talking about with using a fiduciary. That's a very critical conversation that we need to have earlier on, and it's just part of a general push in terms of the education of our society which unfortunately, since we're so crisis-driven, we don't want to deal with that until we have to. And so, you know, at the point at which the dad is in the hospital, I've got to make a decision about whether or not to pull the plug. I guess we need to figure out whether or not there's a health directive at that point. So it's an unfortunate part of our society, and that's what we're hoping. Part of our mission is to get people out there and help spread the word in terms of the importance of the education that needs to be involved. These aren't documents that just need to be drawn up by attorneys that are expensive. These are things that are readily available on the internet. A lot of these things are very easily accessible at this point.
Yeah, and that's it. Well, let me just answer this a little bit further, and then I'll take your question. One of the things people don't do if they don't do estate planning, and unfortunately more than half of people out there don't do estate planning, they don't have a durable power of attorney. So the older person who becomes vulnerable for whatever reasons doesn't have anybody who has the legal authority to step in. And it makes it really easy for a creditor to get a power of attorney. So I think one of the things you can suggest, if you've got an elderly client and they don't have children, they're widowed or they're alone or whatever it is, you can say, you know, have you ever considered what would happen if you weren't able to take care of yourself? And did you know that you can get a power of attorney? And they're free on the internet. All you need is to appoint someone you really trust who's capable, and it costs you $10 to get your signature notarized. That's it. There's nothing wrong with suggesting that they get a power of attorney, and I would encourage you to do so. Now, that's a two-edged sword, because in the wrong hands, a power of attorney is a license to steal, as with our second case study where the caregiver got it and trashed this woman's entire financial safety. But in the right hands, it really is a tool that allows that person to help and protect. And that's what we're after. So your question?